Book of Ruth, and the first thing I believe I mentioned last week, it's really a construction around David. And once someone gets to be king, then they begin to look at their ancestry and things like this. The thing that is peculiar about Ruth is that she's a Gentile, and research today seems to indicate that she's not only a Gentile, but in fact probably a priestess of the Gentile religion. And something to know about the names. The names are rather made up. The names of the two sons that Ruth is, she's married to one of the sons, but the names of the two sons have to do with sickness. And the Naomi, I think, means sweetness, and Ruth has to do with faithfulness or friendship. But the names are all kind of made up to go along with it. So anyway, it says, in the days when the judges were governing, a famine occurred in the country, and a certain man from Bethlehem of Judah went, he and his wife and his two sons, to live in the plains of Moab. First of all, you need to know that's very unusual. When you study the history of Israel, right from the beginning of Abraham, even to the days of Jesus, when a problem occurs, they go to Egypt. And you'll watch that consistently through their history. The Moabites have been very, very hard on the Jews, and so very, very seldom would they have anything to do with the Moabites at all. The Moabites were probably in what you and I would consider southern Jordan today. And they were never a very, very powerful country. But what would happen was every time Israel was weak because of the invasion or something of another country, the Moabites would take it as an opportunity to raid Israel and to basically, harass them. But the Moabites were never strong enough, to go to war with Israel. That would never happen. But when Israel was down, they would go after them. I'd also like you to notice the business of the famine. Famines are very frequent in that part of the world, and we see many mentions of them in the scriptures. It was originally a famine that took Jacob and Joseph, his son, into Egypt, you remember, for the 400 years. So the man's name was Amalek, his wife Naomi and his two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem of Judea. Okay? The Ephraimites are one of the tribes, Ephraim, and they're actually living in Bethlehem. But Bethlehem is not for their tribe. Bethlehem is for the tribe of Judah. Okay? So there are a number of very interesting things going on here. So going to the plains of Moab, they settled there. Amalek, Naomi's husband, died, and she and her two sons were left. Now, the importance of this has to do with the dependents. In their societies, you survive largely by family and relationships. They've gone into an area where they have no family and really have no relationships. And now the one relationship they have, within the community, their own little family, then breaks up. So the two sons, these married Moabite women. One was called Oprah, and Oprah I think means to leave or abandon, and the other was called Ruth, that means faithful or friend. They lived there for about 10 years. Mahlon and Chilion then both died too. And Naomi was thus bereft of her two sons and her husband. Again, the most vulnerable home you can have is a home in which there is no male. And so it is a very serious situation. Incidentally, it would be just as serious if you had a house with no female, because then there's no one going to be passing on the family and this sort of thing. It's just that in cases of no male, no female, they would at least kidnap someone, okay? They would get married or kidnap someone, but you wouldn't end up with a family with no female. but on occasion they would end up in a situation with no mail at all. She then decided to come back from the plains of Moab with her daughters-in-law, having heard in the plains of Moab that God had visited his people and given them food. So basically the famine's over, and Israel is a place where they can go. So she decides to return. Now notice that the principal link she has here actually to Moab. The two girls are both Moabites, and they're in the relationship, with their families, whatever they were. And she wants to go back to Israel. So with her daughters-in-law, she left the place where she was living, and they took the road back to Judea. Naomi said to her two daughters-in-laws, "Go back, each of you to your mother's house. May Yahweh show you faithful love as you have done to those who have died and to me." Okay? So there's a good relationship between Naomi and her daughters-in-law, but what she decides is that they should really go back home. The idea is that they would go home and eventually marry into to other families. They're going back to Israel. The girls don't know this unless Naomi has told them. Their chances as non-Israelis of marrying when they get back to Israel are very, very poor, because the Jews were very, very strong against the influence of non-Jews, particularly prejudiced against Moabites. And so this is not a good situation at all. So she suggests that they go home, and she prays that Yahweh is going to help them. "Yahweh grant that you may each find happiness with a husband." She then kissed them, but they began to weep loudly and said, "No, we shall go back with you to your people." So the two daughters now decide that they in fact are going to go back to live with Naomi in Israel. "Go home, daughters," Naomi replied. "Why come with me? Have I any more sons in my womb to make husbands for you?" This has to do with the Jewish law, that if a man marries a woman in another family, remember their families were a lot of times arranged marriages because of the relationship. But if a man marries a woman in a family and that woman dies, he would marry another single woman in the same family. And the same thing that would happen, a woman would be married into a family. If the husband died, she would wait and marry another son in the same family. And it's because the relationship is more important than what you and I would consider a marriage. The relationship between the families and stuff is much more significant. And the fact is, she is not going to have any more children, and so she tells them to go back. "Go home, daughters, for now I am too old to marry again." My grandmother would disagree with her, but anyway. He says, "Even if I said I still have hope, I shall take a husband this very night and shall bear you sons. Would you be prepared to wait for them until they are grown up?" Okay? So would they be prepared to wait until the children were adults in order for the marriage? "Would you refuse to marry for their sake?" "No, daughters. I'm bitterly sorry for your sakes that the hand of Yahweh should have been raised against me." And Naomi sees herself as the one bringing this on. And it's very true, I think in the Israeli understanding, that if you have disaster in your life, it's a punishment for sin. We notice the only one left of the family, the Jewish family, is Naomi. So she is the one who believes that she is responsible for what has happened here. Okay? They started weeping loudly all over again. Oprah then kissed her mother-in-law and went back to her people, but Ruth stayed with her. Naomi then said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Go home too. Follow your sister-in-law." Notice we have the addition here. She's gone home to her people, and now we add to her God, which is the most important part of this whole thing. What we're going to see in this book is her choice to remain with Naomi becomes a choice mainly about God. And in their communities, I think one of the interesting things about religion, we don't oftentimes talk about religion in this way, but religion is a very strongly communal thing, and it is difficult to hold your own religion if it's difficult within a society that holds another religion. They oftentimes kid about the amount of Mormons in Utah, but it's not just that Mormons are in Utah. If you moved to Utah, it would be more comfortable for you to integrate into the Mormon system. An interesting statistic, there are more Catholics, Japanese-born Catholics in Brazil than there are in Japan. And the reason is, if you go to the country of Brazil, being Brazilian is partly being Catholic. And so you just sort of do that. So to understand that her going to Israel will probably mean that she goes to the new God. And so she encourages them to return to her people and their God. Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you and to stop going with you, because," and we have this passage. This passage is highly used in liturgy in the Catholic Church. I'd also like you to know that years ago when, is it Catherine Kubler-Ross? Forget her first name. But when Catherine Kubler-Ross was doing all the business on death and dying, one of the things that was most interesting, this is the passage most people chose to have read to them as the last scripture passage when they were dying. And so this is the passage. "Wherever you go, I shall go. Wherever you live, I shall live. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I shall be buried. Let Yahweh bring unimaginable ills upon me, and worse ills too, if anything but death should part me from you." Okay? So what she says, first of all, is that her commitment is basically to Naomi. And having entered this commitment to Naomi, she's automatically committed to the land where Naomi lives. She's committed to the God that Naomi worships. She's committed to dying in the place where Naomi dies. She's going to make her life there. Now, remember this, committed to dying where Naomi dies, this young girl's going to live longer than Naomi. But she's going with Naomi, and she's going to stay there, even after Naomi dies. And what she is saying here is she is making a choice to be in Naomi's land. It isn't just a choice to be with Naomi. It is a choice, actually, for the whole life of Naomi. And why would that be? There's something about Naomi that touches her. There's something about Naomi's religion, about Naomi's practices. And when you read this book, one of the things that really strikes me, I'm inclined to think that what's going on with Ruth is that Ruth has been radically struck about Naomi's ability to deal with disaster. She has watched Naomi go through this series of disasters, and the way Naomi has reacted, the way Naomi has come out of it, and we haven't seen her reaction. It's not here at all. All we know is the disasters that occurred, first in Israel, then to come to the country and see the sons die and all this sort of stuff. So we see all the disasters, but something about Naomi's ability to deal with the disasters lets Ruth know that she wants whatever Naomi has. And so she chooses to go back to Israel for that. And she says, "Let Yahweh bring unnameable ills on me, and worse ills too, if anything but death should part me from you." And the idea here is that's just a sort of a classic way of ending things. The one thing that is peculiar about that is she uses the name Yahweh. And now remember, in the Jewish tradition, Naomi would never speak the name, and they probably wouldn't, read and write. So I'm inclined to think it may well be that in the original text, she used the name of her own God. But we went through a couple times in Scripture where editors in the Bible have removed all the names of false gods. And they either replace it with the name of Yahweh or there's a, forget the name of it now, it means Lord of the, Beelzebub. It means Lord of the Flies. And the Jews use that largely for pagan gods, because the pagans were not as hygienic as the Jews, and pagan temples where they had sacrifices were filled with flies. And so the Jews used to call their gods lords of the flies. Seeing that Ruth was determined to go with her, Naomi said no more. So after what Ruth has said, obviously Ruth has chosen and made a decision, and it's a complete decision. I think that what Naomi would look at with regards to Ruth in the first place is that, does Ruth actually know the decision she's making? Does she know it entails a god, a religion, a land, all this sort of thing? It's kind of like, I remember I was talking to a student about 4 years ago, and she was saying that she wanted to spend, when she finished high school, she wanted to spend 2 years in France and then, continue with her education. And I casually asked a question that I thought was really logical and simple, but it terrified her when I said it. I simply asked, do you speak French? And she had never had French at all, And the idea is at least get an intro, learn a menu, okay? But the idea is that oftentimes when people make decisions, we don't quite realize how complicated the decision is. That's probably a healthy thing. We might make no decisions if we knew that. But the idea is to understand they're wider. The two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. The arrival set the whole town astir, and the women said, "Can this be Naomi?" Okay? Now remember, she's been gone a long period of time. In Jewish tradition, pieces of property belong to a family by name, and if no one is living there, like for instance if the family is gone, other people may use it under the Jewish law, but ultimately it belongs to the family if the family ever shows up again. And that's in order to keep names attached to land in Israel. It is historically, today that's all been lost during the Ottoman occupation, but historically in Israel, all land was assigned according to tribes, families, and stuff. This all took place in Joshua. And so they try and maintain the land. I may have told you this, but if a man had no sons, then the second son of another family would marry one of his daughters, and that man would take the last name of the daughter in order to preserve the family name on the land. They had a very complicated system of marriages and stuff in order to ensure that happened. To this she replied, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara." I think Mara means sad. "For Shaddai has made my lot bitter." I'd like you to notice the use of the name Shaddai. Shaddai actually in the early days was an adjective, and it means magnificent or powerful. They aren't really sure. But when you began to speak of the one, they eventually added El to it, and it became one of the names of God. When you say the magnificent one, it's God. When you say the powerful one, it's God. And once they began to do that, the word Shaddai disappeared from Hebrew usage. It came only to be used with El Shaddai with regards to God. So in common usage in Israel today, it's a word that is not used. And so there's some dispute about the meaning as to whether it's powerful or magnificent or whatever. But it's very unusual to find this, and it indicates how old the text is. This text with regards to Ruth is a very old text. So she says, "I departed full, and Yahweh has brought me home empty. Why then call me Naomi, since Yahweh has pronounced against me, and Shaddai has made me wretched." Okay? So she comes back, but she talks about what has happened with her life and feels this is in fact an attack that comes from God. This is how Naomi came home with her daughter-in-law, Ruth the Moabitess, on returning from the plains of Moab. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. This particular verse right here, verse 12, appears to be a much later addition. That the early part we've seen up to this point appears to be generally the story, and then they expanded the story on, and they used this as a linkage, and probably put several stories they had about Ruth together in order to put this book in this way. So Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, well-to-do, and of Elimelech's clan. His name was Boaz. Boaz is a very, very important man. I mentioned one of the ancestors of Jesus. Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go into the field and glean ears of corn in the footsteps of some men who will look on me with favor." In Israel, one of the things they do with regards to social welfare is that when you harvest a field, you can only harvest it once. So like, for instance, if we're harvesting barley, we can go through the field only once. And we, cut down the barley and take it out. And in the process, you drop, shafts of barley and stuff like this. But you may not, under Jewish law, ever go back for it, because what is there belongs by right to the poor in what we would call gleaning. You notice that, for instance, up in Spreckles, that when they harvest lettuce, they harvest only an exact size. All the lettuce field is ripe at the same time. They know how to do that. But you can only harvest an exact size of lettuce. And the genius, incidentally, of those people who harvest lettuce is the ability to be able to do that. In a case of lettuce, there are 12 heads, 6 on the bottom row, 6 on the top. If one of the heads is too big, it will crush all the other heads. And then as you take them out, they're all broken. If one of the heads is too small, they roll around and crush all the heads. In both cases of lettuce are lost. Okay, you have to have an exact thing. But as a result of that, when you harvest lettuce, less than a third of the field is harvested. Okay, as you go through. Too big, too little, whatever. They have developed a way now in which they go through the field a second time, and the second heads of lettuce are not packaged, but are shredded. And they have a machine that shreds them, washes them, and puts them in boxes that are about a 4-foot cube. And they are in McDonald's the same day they're harvested. Okay? They are in these different places all over the world the same day they're harvested. But originally, they would lose a lot of the field, but now they've found a way to harvest what they aren't going to be able to harvest as heads. Okay? So she's going to go over and glean the field. And the thing to notice here is in the footsteps of some man who will look on me with favor. The people who are doing the harvesting can make it very miserable for people who are in there trying to glean. And remember, you want to get in there as quick as you can after the harvest in order to get the stuff before someone else does. And it was possible for people who were harvesting to be very abusive of the people who were gleaning. It's interesting that they would follow God's law and not pick up the grain they dropped, but they wouldn't follow God's law to protect the people who are in the field working. Okay? So she replied, "Go, daughter." So she set out and went to glean in the fields behind the reapers. Chance led her to a plot of land belonging to Boaz of Elimelech's clan. Okay? I'd like you to notice the reference to chance. That's another interesting thing, because if a Jew were writing the earlier thing, he would say God led her. But probably from her own tradition, this story, that chance led her. And this is going to work out very, very well for her. Boaz, as it happened, had just come from Bethlehem. "Yahweh be with you," he said to the reapers. "Yahweh bless you," they replied. That's obviously a traditional greeting and he's basically sending his workers into the field. Boaz said to a servant of his who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" Now, he's come from Bethlehem, and the fact is, every woman, and you could say the same thing of every man. Every man belonged to some family in some household. Every woman was either married or had a father. She belonged in some family. And he does not recognize her. When we talk about Bethlehem, again, I don't know how many of you visited Bethlehem, but Bethlehem, as it exists, downtown central Bethlehem, is probably as big as Bethlehem was in these days. It probably didn't have 500 people. Bethlehem was a very insignificant city, a town. I think you know that one of the passages in Scripture is that the promise that the Messiah would be born in an insignificant place. Bethlehem, the least of all the cities of Judah. Okay, so anyway, he knows everyone and he doesn't recognize her. The servant in charge of the reapers replied, "The girl is the Moabitess, the one who came back with Naomi from the plains of Moab." Okay, so the guy who's in charge knows, and he probably knows because, first of all, it would be relatively easy to recognize her as a Moabitess. One of the reasons is there's dress that's individual in the different societies, so it'd be rather easy to recognize that she's not Jewish. The other thing is he obviously knows from the family, and I would say he probably lives in Bethlehem, whereas Boaz appears to be very, very wealthy, probably a landowner who lived in a compound outside Bethlehem and just maintained these fields. She said, "Please let me glean and pick out what falls from the sheaves behind the reapers." And again, I'd tell you that in Israel, that's a right, okay? She would ask basically because she's going to be there, but no one can say no to her. They could have a situation that would make her very uncomfortable being there, but legally, under Jewish law, you can't say no to her. Thus she came, and here she stayed with hardly a rest from morning until now. Okay? And poor people in Israel are able to really survive in this way. The other thing about the Jewish thing is that if you're in a field, you always have the right to eat anything in the field. This gleaning is the right to carry stuff out of the field. So like if you were in an apple orchard, you have the right to eat any apples. You do not have the right to carry an apple out of the orchard unless you're gleaning, okay? And that's after they've taken harvest. So Boaz said to Ruth, "Listen to me, daughter. You must not go gleaning in any other field. You must not go away from here. Stay close to my work women." Okay? So what he's doing is basically telling her she's safe. Remember, her mother-in-law told her to find a place where she could glean safely. And Boaz is basically saying that. He says, here you're safe. I'm going to ask you while you're here to stay close to the women who are working in the fields. The women did harvesting just like men did. And so stay close to the women who are in the fields. Keep your eyes on whatever part of the field they're reaping and follow behind. I've forbidden my men to molest you. Okay? So he's provided for her safety. And I would say that the way this text is worded and what we're going to see of Boaz, he probably has forbidden his men to molest any woman. But simultaneously, in order to enforce that, what he has is that the women who are gleaning go behind